Cedric Chin, welcome to the work item. It's an honor to have you here. Welcome.
Hi, it's glad to be here.
So, Cedric, I have discovered you through your blog that you've been writing for a few years now. But why don't you tell us in your own words, what are you working on these days?
Right. I mostly write the blog these days. It used to be, I used to run a software engineering office in Vietnam. And I think if you've been reading the blog for some time, you probably know that a lot of my early writing has been based out of experiences, trying to sort of make sense of the business experiences operating in Vietnam. We bootstrapped a company in Singapore. So the Vietnam office was literally software engineers for the Singaporean company. We bootstrapped it to 4.5 million in annual revenue from scratch when I left. And in the process of that, I encountered a whole bunch of business people. And early on in the blog, I wrote about career moats, which is the topic of your podcast, or rather, like how to think about your career is the topic of your podcast. But eventually, the blog became sort of like me making sense of what is it like all these business people that I met during that journey, right? And these were people who were not educated, and I'm sure every culture has a sort of like the stereotype, right? Where these people are incredibly street smart, they never had a degree, and then they can like negotiate or like run circles around you in business. And eventually, the blog became as it is right now. It used to be about careers, but now it's mostly about business and the expertise of business and how do you accelerate the acquisition of that expertise. Pretty much in the last 2 years, really. So when I left that company, I actually started the blog to sort of learn content marketing, and then eventually it took a life of its own and became sort of like a place for me to sort of make sense of what exactly is it, these people, how did they get so good? And then people began reading, and sometime in the pandemic, I think sometime in 2020, a business mentor sort of said, like, you know that Substack is a thing now, right? You should turn on memberships or subscriptions. And I said, oh, I didn't know Substack was a thing. And then I turned on subscriptions. The blogging platform I was on allowed me to do so. I use Ghost. And 2-3 years later, it basically pays for all my bills. I don't have to do any more consulting. I figured out content marketing, and now I'm on this sort of like journey of business expertise. What is it? How do you accelerate it? And I've discovered certain things that I don't think many people write about. So I'm quite pleased with that. And so yeah, that's the answer. Like, when do you discover the blog, by the way?
It's been a few years. I want to say it 2 or 3 years back. It was a bit before the pandemic. And I remember because the career moats topic that you just brought up was something that I actually was looking up at the time. And in my head, I had that idea of, well, how do you set yourself apart in a career, right? Because if you look at a big company, and I spent most of my career working at a big company, it's always, you have like a large number of product managers and engineers and everyone else. And it's like, how do you actually become a valuable addition to the team while also building out that unique skill set that is only specific to you? And I couldn't really articulate that well. And I kind of tried to figure out, like, what does that actually mean? And I started kind of looking up different things. And I would like Google for, like unique career perspectives or anything like that. And I remember your blog came up, and this was the idea of a career moat. And I was like, okay, that kind of clicked with me because I was like, career moat, that makes sense, right? Like if you think of like the medieval moat that protect the castle, I was like, I wonder what that is. And what hooked me on the blog was completely different, by the way. And that was career mode was the start. But then what I discovered is your ideas around the meta game, right? The discoveries around kind of the meta of the system that you're operating in. And that to me, like a lot of things fell into place and it clicked. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And yeah, that's how I discovered your blog. And what I also love about it is that I remember you were actually talking about your like the company in Vietnam, and you were talking about the early starts, and you're speaking from direct experience in your blog. So this is not a hypothetical. This is something that we talked about right before the show. Like if you read a lot of the blogs, the podcasts, and the public, a lot of them talk in hypotheticals from folks that have not started a company, but say like, if I would start a company, here's how I would do this. It's like, but that's not the same, right? It's absolutely not the same. And you're speaking from experience.
Yes, and that's a really big thing in the blog. I make it very clear when I'm speaking from experience, and I make it very clear when I'm sort of like, oh, this is something that I read, and it kind of makes sense, but I've not actually tested it. So like, let me caveat this to sort of say like, here's the thing, and I need to go practice it. And it's actually really common for me to. Here's an idea, and then I write about the idea, right? So I summarize the blog and summarize the book. It could be usually it's a book, and or research paper. And then 8 months later, I come back and go, okay, so I finally put it to practice. Here is what I found. Like here are all the little things that it's not obvious at all if you're just reading a blog post or you're reading research papers or you're reading a popular, God forbid you read a popular science book, because that's most likely to be wrong or like not most likely to not be useful. And then it takes 8 months or like however long. Like recently, I just came back from a 4 month experiment where I went and relocated to Kuala Lumpur, a different city, to train judo for 5 hours a day because I wanted to sort of see like what does deliberate practice actually feel like. And most of us don't have the opportunity to experience proper deliberate practice. And I should sort of explain that a little by saying that deliberate practice is a technical term. I always have to say this because like Anders Ericsson chose the name in a it's a really terrible name, to be honest. It's not practicing deliberately. Deliberate practice is a technical term with certain properties, and most of us don't operate in domains where we can have actual deliberate practice because it requires a coach, it requires some pedagogical development, which is a fancy way of saying that it requires exercises that breaks down the skill that you want to train into specific sub skills, trains those specific sub skills, and then builds it back up into the main skill, right? Which means that you need a coach and you need some sort of like knowledge around how to train the skill. So most of us in our careers, we don't have experience with deliberate practice, and I wanted to experience like how does it actually feel trying to do deliberate practice. And I went off and I spent 4 months of my life. It was a judo coach that I found that I made friends with who was based out of Kuala Lumpur. He had represented Malaysia for the World Championships and placed 13 in the world in 1993. Um, and and then I used that sort of like and then sort of the end point of the experiment was me going to the Malaysian nationals. Uh, and then it was 4 months and I could write, how many pieces did I write? I think I wrote 3 pieces based out of the experience. One was to introduce the experiment. One was to talk about what does it actually look like when you're coming up with new pedagogical exercises or like new exercises to train in deliberate practice. And then the third one was sort of like the summary of the entire experience. This is a team, right? Like, so right now I'm trying to figure out how to become data driven in business. That was an experiment that actually started before the judo experiment, but then I put it on hold, right? Because the nationals and the timeline of the judo experiment required me to stop that for a while. But it's going to take maybe I won't be surprised if it takes me another like 8 months before I can sort of talk about, oh, here's what it actually learns to have a causal understanding of the business in your head. It's going to take that long to instrument and then run experiments and then sort of figure out like how does the like CommonCog actually grow. So the business in this case is the blog, right? Yes, I know this. I've gone all over the place a little.
No, no, no. This is great, and this is precisely, I think, you've kind of alluded to the fact as to why I find your perspective so interesting. Is that if you read a lot of the common management books or books about entrepreneurship or books about startups or any of that field, you see a lot of these very, I'd say, hand wavy, it's like, yeah, like it would be nice to like focus on growing your team and give your team the space, but how do you give your team the space? How do you actually make sure that you manage underperformance? Because there's just so much of this generic, unactionable advice. And you're taking the perspective of like diving deep. And I've read your adventures in judo, the recent one, and it looked painful. I'll put it this way. It looked very painful. Um, Tell me more about, when you think about the business, whether it's the blog or whether it's the company that you worked at before, what motivates you to think kind of deeply about a lot of the problems, the challenges at hand? Because again, I'm drawing from perspectives of other folks that I have worked in the past, and they look at it as like, a job is a job. I got to make sure that I write the documents and I fill out the spreadsheets and I fix the bugs, but that's about it. And you're taking the perspective of, I'm actually going to go deep into this and figure this out. What motivates you for that?
I guess sort of the base expectation is I if I'm interested in the thing and definitely sort of set the stage. I am interested in business. I want to be a good business operator. I want to run a good business, a well-run business, and to some degree, I succeeded with in Vietnam. Actually, yeah, I would say that yes. No, I shouldn't be that humble. I did succeed in Vietnam. My boss was really happy with what I did, and he stole some of the things that I learned for to run operations in Singapore, because he was running things in Singapore. Singapore was more sales and marketing and customer support, and a lot of the things that I put into practice, and then I sort of like shared with him. Here's how I think about retention, or here's how I think about recruiting. Right? He eventually adapted to the Singaporean context. Now, with that said, I also have noticed that when working with people, not everybody seems to want to figure out like here's how the thing actually works, right? They sort of muddle their way through, and sometimes they achieve success, like great success, but then like when the thing stops working, then they don't know what to do, right? So for example would be retention. Like a lot, my old boss before, like we sort of worked this out, we hashed this out over the course of 2 years. His model was very simple for retention. Like you pay people enough and then they stay, right? And that clearly isn't the case, right? There are clearly other factors that involve whether somebody stays with you. And I mean, if you want to keep people and you want to build a team around people who can stay long enough to justify your investment in them, wouldn't you want to figure out what factors affect whether they stay or leave? Wouldn't you want to have like a causal model in your head so that you can sort of predict like, oh, this person's at risk of leaving, right? Um, and so for that particular example, it was like trial and error, and so like lots of thinking, lots of like, could this be the model? Could like, but this doesn't explain this person, or this doesn't explain this situation. And then you sort of collect examples as well when you go read biographies and you read blog posts that details other people's experiences. And to sort of like call out something that you just said earlier, I find that it is very true that you can tell when somebody has real experiences or not, right? And sort of like the factor that you want to sort of like look out for when you're reading a blog post is not only like does this person have actual experience, because that's really not the differentiating factor, right? There are rubbish writers out there who are like sneaking some experience, and experience is like so stupid, so surface level, so useless. What you want to look for is you want to look for trade-offs, painful, difficult trade-offs in the experience, because this means that like, there is something valuable there, right? Because like the author has touched reality, and reality always involves some kind of trade-off to get the goal you want, right? And so you're looking for traces of that trade-off and some reasoning around like, has this author really thought about like how to place the trade-offs, and like what are those trade-offs, and can they articulate? And the more articulate they are, the more able they are to explicate that and make it obvious and legible to you, the more useful the experience becomes. But even if they're not able to sort of process their experience, you can sort of like see in their experience, have they experienced some tension between some trade-off, and then like how did those story progress and how did they deal with that tension, right? So that's when experience is useful, and that's when you can sort of like, oh, this author is actually believable. They've actually touched the reality, and reality has pushed back on them. So to sort of come to this example, I think it's really useful to have sort of a causal model to explain like what's going on in your work or in your experience. I think the model that I eventually came up with was there are 6 factors that affect whether a person stays, retention of an employee, and yes, salary is one of them. But the other 5 factors, sorry, the other 5 factors are, and I think one of them you can't control. So the other 5 factors is mastery, which is obvious. Like, how, are they learning? Are they actually meeting their learning goals? Autonomy is actually one of the most important things. Uh, there's a lot of burnout research, and for those listeners who don't know, there is a long burnout guide in CommonCog.com, which sort of details here's the state of the research on burnout. And one of the most surprising things in that research is that researchers actually spend a lot of time studying the inverse of burnout, which is engagement. And one of the most important elements for engagement, which is the opposite of burnout, is autonomy. So autonomy is obviously a factor. And then what else were they? I think it's the relationship with their peers and their boss, and that's a huge factor. Purpose, and purpose is actually not as important as people might think. It's important for some people. It's not important for a lot of people, surprisingly, because if you are in a position where you really enjoy your workers, I mean your peers and your boss, you enjoy your team, you actually might not care about purpose as much, right? But I think the way purpose really matters is that you must not believe that it stands against your morals, like the work that you do. And then the final thing is how the work fits into your life. And this one is actually out of your control because sometimes when somebody goes through a life changing event, they get married, or they have their first kid, that changes their relationship to the work, and that usually can be a trigger factor for them leaving the job, and that's out of your control. But as a boss, you sort of like need to watch out for, hey, like there's a big life change in this person's sort of broader life outside of work, and I need to be prepared if they want to quit, because that tends to happen depending on your understanding of the person and the relationship the person has to the work. So 6 factors, and you can sort of do a checklist in your head every one-on-one of like whether these factors are likely to cause the person to leave. And later I talked to a founder who told me that he had independently come up with a checklist that's very similar to mine, which sort of gives me some confidence that this checklist, I don't think I found any other factor in the years since I came up with this. And he actually automated it. He would send I can't remember how he did it. Was it a Google's or Zapier, Google Forms or Zapier? But he would send ahead of every one-on-one every month. He would send a sort of form on a scale of 1 to 10, like rate, and then the questions sort of map to each of these things. And then he would say like, what I would look out for is not the absolute value, but whether the value has changed, because everybody has a different baseline. And like if this particular week or this particular month, I think he did one-on-ones once a month as well. He was like, if they're not happy with the mastery sort of value, right? Then we'll talk about that, because something obviously has gone wrong with the work they're assigned, or whatever they've been doing for the past month. And I thought that was really smart because instead of me sort of like going through the checklist in my head during the one-on-one, right? He's sort of like automating a bit, and he has a history of, so like we can map out and see if there's any huge variation.
Also, something that you mentioned stood out is survivorship bias. I think this is the part of the believability factor, right? Is folks that, let's say, start a successful business, whether it's again a startup or it becomes a big enterprise, or they uh, build a YouTube channel that has a lot of followers, or whatever it might be, any activity. Oftentimes, folks that look from outside in as to what did they do, they see what worked for them and they try to replicate it, one on basically like one to one, of saying like, oh, they did this, I'm going to do exactly that, they did this, I'm going to do exactly that, and try to get to success. But also, folks forget that there's a lot of folks that follow the exact same steps and failed, but nobody hears about that, right? So in your models, in your thinking, I like the framing of basically believability being the counter to this, survivorship bias influence decision making.
Maybe we should define believability first,
Sure,
and sort
let's
of
do
talk
it.
about. Yeah, so believability is this idea from Ray Dalio, that he wrote in his book Principles, and I think I first encountered the idea in 2011 when Principles was literally like this badly formatted PDF on Ray Dalio's hedge fund's website. And then he sort of polished it up and he actually published it. And I only took it seriously and I think put it to practice in circa around 2018 when he published the actual book. And I don't know why it took me that long to sort of like take it seriously, but it was an influence, but I didn't sort of rigorously sort of work out all the implications. Believability has 2 properties. It is when you're listening to the advice of the person, you need to ask yourself, is this person believable on this particular topic that they're giving advice on? And Dalio says that like the protocol for getting advice is, if they're more believable than you, shut up, right? Just don't argue, suppress whatever sort of thoughts that you have, or opinions that you have. This person is clearly more believable than you. They have had 3 successes in this particular thing that they're giving you advice about. Why are you wasting time sort of thinking about your thoughts and your model and your frame of the thing, right? When you could sort of like be asking questions and mining their way of looking at reality, right? So that's like the first one. The second one is like, if you're sort of equal believability, both of you have kind of the same level of success, you can debate the person. You're allowed to debate the person. And then the sort of the third thing is, if they're less believable than you just have to spend the bare minimum amount of cognitive effort to make sure that they're not what they're saying is like totally not completely ridiculous, or like it's not a argument that you've not considered before, and then you can sort of just ignore that. This rubs people the wrong way because it's very similar to ad hominem, right? Which is like, you toss out the argument when it based on the person that's making the argument. But then you forget that like when it comes to practical advice or practical things, you actually, it really does matter who the person is, right? When we want to ask for advice for swimming, you don't go to somebody who has never swum before, right? And sort of like ask them for advice for swimming. No, you go to somebody who is an experienced swimmer, ideally a competitive swimmer, ideally a coach, right? A competitive coach, and ask them for swimming advice. So why does this not apply to everything else in our lives, right? Why does so at like the standard for ad hominem applies when it comes to argumentation, but you have to remember that even in courts of law, when we call a witness to the stand, we have to sort of establish, the court or like the prosecutor has to establish, like, why is this person believable on the topic that they're giving testimony for, right? So it matters when it comes to matters of business, and there are lots of very interesting implications when you take believability seriously. Like, for example, one thing is that if the person um, has high believability in one area, that doesn't mean that they're high believability in another area. And it can be scoped very tightly. So I've been in meetings where a senior person sort of like talks over a junior person, but the junior person has more believability in copywriting. It's very narrow skill. And sure, the executive is much more experienced in just about everything else that this senior person has never done. I mean, sorry, this junior person has never done. But this junior person, at least for this specific task, when we're sort of talking about rewriting this landing page, this junior person actually has more believability and more successes, a history of successes. So like the senior person should just shut up, right? And indeed, I have actually called the, like, in such a situation, I put the senior person aside. I was like, can you just like stop? This is not productive. You have like zero believability. I have enough marketing experience right now to know that like whatever suggestions you're giving are completely useless, right? And I was a lot nicer about that than that, obviously. But but in my head, I'm going like, can you please shut up? Because like it's you're not contributing anything here. You have zero expertise here. Um, and that's sort of like one sort of way of looking at it that's not obvious. The other sort of thing that's not that obvious, I think, is um, uh, sometimes when people are very successful, right? Uh, you could sort of say like they have survivorship bias because even sort of three successes might not be enough to sort of overcome the fact that, you know, in real life there's survivorship bias, there's also the path dependence of luck. So they just need to have one success, and then all the future successes, you know, become more probable. But believability is not necessarily a catch-all filter, right? It's just a best attempt filter. If you are in a more constrained domain, I like to reason about judo, but you can sort of like replace judo with any sport that you know. When you see somebody succeed, just because and they have like they're believable because they've used the technique more than 3 times, and you've seen them in competition use the technique more than 3 times or whatever. When you ask them for advice, it's not necessarily true that you're able to pull off the technique, right? Because maybe their body is different, or maybe they have some specific way of thinking, or some specific sort of advantage that you don't have. But what you have is an existence proof that this technique can be done, can be successful for this person, and they have at least 3 instances of success to tell you this. And so like when you try it, you can sort of like go work forward and say like, oh, I know that there is some probability of success here. It might not work for me, but at least it's better than going to Joe Random blog who has never done this before and getting advice from him, right? And so like believability is actually a really useful filter for everything in life. And there are sort of instances on Twitter, or when you're sort of surfing around where you're like, who is this guy? And does he actually have believable like experiences to talk about program? It could be programming, could be marketing. And then like if the person doesn't really have any real successes, then I'll just close the tab or like mute the person or block the person, right? And I've actually done that on Twitter, and it's surprisingly useful for getting at people who have actually accomplished things. I don't know if that answers the question. I have no idea what
It
the original
does. It,
question
it really
was.
does. And especially because you know, mentioned Twitter, and there's always these threads, you know, like the 10 things successful people do
Yes.
every morning. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure getting up at 5 in the morning, like every day, is the key to success. Like there's nothing else involved at all. Right. Like I feel like folks often tend to oversimplify because listening to you describe this problem, right? Like it's very easy if you look at something that is very simplistic and within your reach, that you can easily say, like, oh, sure, you know, I can drink juice smoothies every day and then be successful. Versus you actually have to dissect the problem, understand the P&L statements. You have to understand like a whole bunch of kind of the business logic that is not as trivial, right? And people get drawn to the trivial things because that stuff is easier. It just is. And you want to not spend as much effort, right?
Yeah, and I think you just brought up a really important point which I forgot, which is again not obvious when it comes to believability. Believability is really important because reality has a lot of surprising detail. So there's a famous blog post out there. I can't remember who it's by, but it, the title says it all, right? Reality has a lot of surprising detail, and when you want advice to do something, you want to take it from somebody who has crashed against the rocks of reality and can come back with advice at the right level of detail because you know, if you have no experience in the domain and you sort of take Joe random blog with no believability and then a high believability person, if the person, if these two people are sufficiently smart, their advice can be just as articulate and well argued and internally consistent, right? But then you would try this guy, the if you try the advice of the non-believable guy, you will find a lot more difficulty than if you tried the guy who was the advice of the person who was believable, right? So it's super important to be very careful with who you take the advice from. It will People are like internal consistency and ability to make a coherent argument and the beauty of the writing. These are all things. These are all tricks that can sort of trick you into thinking, oh, this advice must be true because it sounds right and it's logically consistent. And it's like, no, no, that's not the bar for truth. The bar for truth of when you're trying to act in the real world is, does this actually work for you? And if you're interested in that, then believability really matters because sufficiently smart people can say whatever. Like I can come up with, like, you can get some random, you know, smug idiot off the street who has gone to a nice school or like really high IQ, and then they can give you like an incredibly nice thesis about how to swim. But if they never swam, then why are you listening to them? Because it's likely their advice is at the wrong level of abstraction or the wrong level of detail. So anyway, so this is one of my bugbears. I get very animated as you can see
It's
about it
it's
because
it's a very astute observation too, because something that you mentioned also literally like popped a light bulb, and in the sense that even when people ask about career advice, like for me, because I've been in the industry for like a decade, it's I can't give them advice if they're just starting out. Like nothing that I say is relevant because I've been so far removed from that point in their career that for me to tell you like, oh, how do you succeed fresh out of college? I don't know. I've been like a long time out of college, right? And for you to understand how to succeed, you probably need to talk to somebody who's more believable, which is somebody that actually was successful shortly like after your own level where you're at, right? Like an executive is not going to provide good advice for somebody starting out their career because I feel like that there is kind of that spectrum of what do I do to be successful? And it probably depends on the field. Now that I think about it, it's like there's certain areas, right? Like where you'd be like, if this is about starting a business, if this is about bootstrapping something, it likely has the half life is likely longer than for something like promotions in your career, for example.
I have a business mentor. His name is Dinesh, and he likes to say that you want to, when you're giving advice in sort of the context of like an executive and a person fresh out of college. So Dinesh is a successful founder here in Singapore, and but he consistently gives good advice to people in university. So when I met him, I was a second year university student, and he was a founder, and it wasn't clear that he was successful yet, right? But he has consistently given me good advice throughout my career. And I once asked him, okay, I don't think I asked him, he volunteered this information. He was like, the way that you want to think about giving advice is that you want to look for context independent frameworks that don't depend on path dependence, that don't depend on the particulars of the context, and that are idempotent, like they don't change through time. So, like, I believe that my career modes framework will be useful regardless of whether it's whether you're an executive is giving it or not, right? Because I believe that the career modes as a framework is context free. But a lot of advice. The problem with context free frameworks is that very few context free frameworks are super useful, or at least at the level of technical detail that anybody off the street can pick it up. Like if maybe we should talk about career modes. I don't know if you want to, uh,
Yeah,
but
we totally can.
oh, okay. So career modes is basically just the observation that if you want the job security today, is not how long you can hold on to your current job, but how easy it is to get your next job, right? And there's like a whole bunch of societal factors which I won't go into, but I think just sort of saying that people listening to this who are still sort of mid or at the beginning of their careers will probably like feel like, yeah, this sounds about right, right? This is the nature of our labor market today. My grandfather had like an incredible career that he could like retire and had a pension, but we don't have that anymore.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So given this in mind, and to be clear, I developed this framework to sort of help me. I couldn't articulate it then, of course, but this was sort of like the end of university because I wanted to start a company, and I was also like thinking like, what's the way? How should I think about my career such that if I fail when starting the company, I don't sort of crash out completely. And the way that I sort of build around that is like if I have a career mode, which is my ability to get a job, so that regardless of whatever startup I do fails, um, I still would be easily able to get a job, right? So what does that consist of? And I think the framing that I finally settled on, which is not mine, it's actually Cal Newport's language, is rare and valuable skills. And if you have rare and valuable skills, it is very clear that you can easily get a job regardless of like what happens to your career, what happens to whatever you do, whether you do a startup and you crash and burn, right? And now, if you sort of zoom in on rare and valuable skills, the really difficult thing actually is the rare bit, not the valuable bit. By definition, anything that you learn, well, not anything, but most of the things you learn in university, for example, will be valuable, right? Or like a technical school or whatever, because there is some element. As much as like universities want to have this model of like, oh, we're building people for the world, they do sort of respond to industry demands. At least for the engineering schools, or if you go to computer science, which which is what I did, there is an element and influence of industry on these degrees, right? So valuable is actually really common. Rare is not easy. And when you sort of like frame it as rare and valuable skills, you need to sort of articulate why is the set of skills that you have rare, right? And I go through in the blog, I sort of go through a couple of examples of this. So the one example is that it's rare because it's icky and disgusting, and nobody wants to do it. And sort of like the canonical example there would be COBOL programmers, right? Like COBOL is such a terrible programming language, but banks still run on COBOL. So therefore, anybody who is a good COBOL programmer would have a career mode because like you leave, okay, there's only like a small handful of programmers who can maintain all these legacy systems in the banks, and banks are not moving off them. Well, they are trying to move off them, but it takes like years, right? So long as those systems exist, you have a career mode because you can easily get another job. Um, and my particular career mode is actually of this type, which is that the right out of university, I went and ran this the engineering office in Vietnam, and the insight that made me do that was a conversation that I had with Willis Lee, who runs Tech in Asia, which is like the TechCrunch or the of Southeast Asia. And he sort of like he didn't know what he was doing when he said this to me. But he gave me sort of like the insight of like the game in Southeast Asia is not really about Singapore. It's about sort of if you're a startup, you have to expand in the entire region to sort of create enterprise value, to create like a good, attractive story that you can sell to VCs or to get acquired or to IPO. You need to have like some sort of regional story because individually each country in Southeast Asia is too small, right? And so when I heard that, I was like, well, I could probably. I'm not the best programmer in my cohort. I'm not the best product manager in my cohort, but I'm probably the best programmer and the best product manager that you can get who is willing to learn how to operate in these very messy, uncomfortable offices, like to go to these various countries around Southeast Asia and set up the offices. And there's a very small group of people like me, which I eventually got to know over the years. And the career mode turned out to be right, which is like if I fail today, I could go and offer these services to a company, and it's highly likely that I'll find a company that would find this valuable. And there's a very small set of people like me, so therefore it's likely that I have a career mode. Now this has sort of changed so much because the dynamics of startups in Southeast Asia has changed over the last 3-4 years, 5 years actually. So this is no longer as true, but it was true for many years after I I executed this plan. Um, so that's one example. Another example would be you're just the best at the skill. You are Jeff Dean. You are like a legend in computer programming, and everybody knows that you're a legend at it. And this is a lot harder, but it's definitely possible to be the best at something, right? Or to be very well known for this particular subskill that is valuable. And there are examples, of course. This, I guess, one example might be what Ilya Sutskever of OpenAI. So he's hugely in demand. He definitely has a career mode. He can quit tomorrow and like have like 20 companies like say, can you please come work for us and we'll pay you like $1 million a year or something like that, right? Um, Another sort of example would be, oh gosh, it's been some time since I worked this all out and I sort of have left the topic behind. I think one example also one example that I gave us, and the principle here is you're early to a domain. So the domain is not, it's not that clear that the domain is hot and valuable, but you were early to it, and then you develop certain. It was easier to sort of get good at it. It was easier to build reputation, and then the path dependence of you being early to that thing sort of builds over time. And the example that I gave, I think, was uh, the early pioneers of the web. I think Jacob Nielsen was the example, one example that I cited, who basically came up with usability. No, he didn't come up with usability research, but he applied usability research to the web just as the web was taking off. And that sort of like set his career for the rest of his life, right? And so like there probably will be some equivalent set of people who would be able to do this for Apple's spatial computing thing, right? You can make your name sort of like, I figured out how to do good design in spatial computing. In the same way that there were designers and programmers who made their name early on when touchscreen interfaces was new with the mobile, like the iPhone Android boom, right, of the 2000 circa 2007 2008. Anyway, so that's career modes in general. How did we get to this topic?
Yeah, I think it's actually, now that we talk about career mode, something that I wanted to ask is, when it comes to rare skills, right? You kind of alluded to the fact that there's several ways of defining what rare actually means. And one of these definitions is well, yeah, be very good at it, which makes sense. It's basically like we talked about earlier, like deliberate practice, and you kind of have to make sure that you're understanding kind of the field. But things like, you know, understanding and being early in a technology, that seems like a, you have to tolerate some level of risk, right? Because there's so many new technologies popping up, and it's not always immediately clear that this is going to lead to success. Like you brought up spatial computing, a good example, right? Like if we look at the demos that exist today, for some folks that might give you flashbacks, like, okay, this is stuff that we've kind of had already, right? Like it's a fancier packaging and it's a little bit better technologically, but is this really going to be as groundbreaking as we make it seem? Like, is it worth for me right now to throw myself into that and start kind of studying like the 3D modeling and understanding the 3D space and operating in like the building the software for it? Or is this going to be a fad? Right? Because
Yes.
we've seen a lot of technologies that also like on the surface look exciting, and then a year later it's like, yeah, whatever. But the corollary to that is, interestingly too, is that sometimes technology takes some time to ramp up, and it's very hard to tell, right? Like when to give up. You brought up again the example of touchscreens, like iPhone and Android. Before iPhone and Android, we had like Palm Pilots and Windows Mobile, right? Like old touchscreen devices with, you know, a whole bunch of capabilities in your pocket. Never took off. And then the iPhone and Android came to station, it just exploded.
Yep.
So what's your
Or
framework? Like
AI.
what's your thinking there? Yeah.
Yeah. I talk about this with my friends quite a bit, right? Because like if we sort of zoom in on AI itself, which is the current hype cycle, right? It's AI has been around for a long time, but it's not clear that transformer models were the unlock. In fact, when the paper came out in 2017, so I have a friend who works in research in the area, and it didn't seem like a big deal um, until quite a bit later. And now it's too late. Now it's obviously very clearly too late, right? You can't be early to build skill here, because there are other people who are way earlier than you, and they've sort of like, and there are a lot of people jumping on the bandwagon, but we'll see whether they'll last. Um, this is I think the answer that I have to your question, which is like, how do you figure out what's the next big thing? Correct. Is that you can't. You really can't. If you look, I merely sort of call out this pattern as something that does exist, right? As a career mode, because very clearly some people have built a career mode in this manner. But if you sort of look at their real histories, they were at the right place at the right time. They got lucky. They got lucky because they were following their nose. They had the right set of interests and skills that enabled them to see this. Like Nielsen was still interested in usability testing on the internet, even after the dot-com boom and bust, right? After the dot-com bust. And I think there are other examples as well of people who became really good web designers. Uh, Doug Bowman being one of them. I don't know if people listening to this will know him, but he was like a very early designer at Blogger, and he is a famous designer. I think later he became like VP of design at Twitter or something like that. So obviously he has had a wonderful career, and he made his name sort of working, doing the hard work of getting good at web design in the ashes of the dot-com bust, right? So in this, with this particular career mode, it's not that plannable. But things like my career mode, or like my old career mode, which was like the ability to sort of like see, hey, like there's this demand and it's icky. People don't really want to be uncomfortable to old countries and figure out how to operate there and be willing to fly a lot. That can be a career mode. That's a lot easier to predict. Another example of this would be I gave an example in one of the career mode blog posts of this person. Like, you are at an intersection of skills that are rare, and that are valuable. And I gave this example of this person who I know personally. He probably wouldn't want his name said out loud, so I'll keep his name. Like, let's just call him John. And what John specializes in is he specializes in planning fiber optic cable. Like, if you want to lay down a fiber optic cable between, like, I don't know, like you want to connect to a data center, or you want to lay an undersea cable to sort of expand the internet connectivity of a country, you go to a large company like Alcatel-Lucent, and then, or something like that, and then you go talk to one of the people, and then they will give that job to somebody like him. And there's very few people like him, because you basically need to know a whole bunch of things. You need to know the physics of these optical cables. You need to be able to like reason about the internet penetration, internet growth rate. You need to know the legal sort of like systems, both in terms of the country that you're building the pipeline in, as well as like maritime law. And then you need to do like all these calculations of like what's the cost trade-off with the what do you call it? Like, there are things called repeaters, which you have to put to sort of boost the signal. But if you put too many of them, that's a high maintenance cost, right? And where do you put them? So you need to have like a map of the ocean floor to sort of figure this out. There are very few people who are good at all of these things, and they're basically all overworked and they're all overpaid. And every time they quit, somebody sort of, one of these large companies snaps them up immediately and gives them like a 20% pay raise, right? And they're so rare because the set of skills that you need are from so many different disparate disciplines that it becomes really hard to train one of these people. And so they have a career mode. And so that's a bit more predictable, right? So what I'm trying to say is like the overall principle is more important than the actual instantiation of the principle. There are multiple ways to get to a career mode, and you sort of have to figure out like what it is for that will work for your particular career, because everybody's career is different, right? Everybody's career is path dependent. And I think with regard to the chase the be early to a big new thing, that tends to be a bit more path dependent and luck based. And if you really look at these people, they tend to be the ones who are just sort of happen to be interested in it, and they were following their nose, and then it turned out to be a valuable thing, right? So it's not easy to replicate that particular form of a career mode, but I have to sort of include it because clearly it does exist.
And I like the overlap of different skills creating that mode, where it's not just exclusive, like you mentioned, like maritime law. Just being good at maritime law is probably going to cap your career mode, right? Like, okay, you're good at it, sure, but when you combine that with the ability of like, I know the physics of fiber optics, and I have experience like putting like undersea cable and understanding like the sea boundaries and how different countries, like, that makes it immensely more valuable and rare, is because of that combination. You're stacking the Lego bricks of your skills instead of just focusing on just one exclusive thing, which is probably would be much harder to get through, right? Like if you're looking at, I like that framework actually. If you're looking at somebody that is a very good programmer, right? Like somebody that is a software engineer and they're very good at, let's say, Python, and they just can spit out Python code like day and night. But then you find somebody who's good at Python and finance, and they can build you the exact financial models they want. They understand the framework, and that becomes that much more valuable because that developer now has more opportunities to go get hired versus somebody that just knows Python.
Yes, I would like to sort of caution. So, like, one quirk of the framework, which might not be obvious if you don't sort of like think about it for a bit, is that it's actually a lot more demand side driven than supply side. I think when most people think about their careers, they think in terms of skills or like certifications that they can get, which is very supply side, right? But the career modes framework assumes that you deeply understand the shape of demand for a set of skills and that you're able to watch for that shape of demand, right? So the example of the what do you call it, like the fiber optics cable example that I gave earlier, clearly if some institution set up a course that trained people for this skill, that career mode would quickly erode, maybe not immediately, but maybe over the course of 10 years becomes less and less valuable because there's more and more people who have that set of disparate skills, right? And similarly for any other sort of career mode, my career mode changed because the dynamics of startups in Southeast Asia changed over the course of the last 5 years, plus COVID, right? The career mode framework really does require you to keep a finger on the pulse of the shape of the demand for your set of skills. And it also means that you are very specific, you know specifically the set of companies that might be interested in your set of skills, because by definition, if you have a career mode, it is valuable to some set of companies. And to sort of like jump on your example of finance and Python, one example that I like to give to friends was like, if you specialized in, if you're just like a software engineer at Stripe, right, then it's not very, like you're just one of many. But if you are the software engineer who deeply understands what do you call it, the cash transfer, or like, there's no, ACH is not the right term for Southeast Asia because ACH is primarily an American term. But if you are the equivalent expert for all of the money transfer systems and the new emerging money transfer systems in Southeast Asia and Asia, like in Japan and Korea, you become a lot more interesting to companies like Stripe or Adyen, who need a specialist to integrate their payment systems with all these disparate payment rails, right? So if you became good at that, you could say that this career mode is like a set of overlapping skills that are rare, or it could be just icky because people don't like to learn the ins and outs of like these terrible APIs.
This is going back to the original kind of topic of the conversation that you mentioned, is there's a lot of people that ignore the opportunity that exists in the non-glamorous, as I refer to them, like almost like plumbing, right? Of the a lot of the, like, let's say tech being one of the industry. Like there's a lot of requirements and expertise that is needed in fields like, platform security, or fields like basically like performance optimization. But a lot of people don't see this as like, oh, but like my product is not a public product, and then like I won't be able to like write blog posts about it and show you screenshots because it's all plumbing, right? But that
Right.
plumbing is what powers a lot of the underlying infrastructure that actually, because of its non-glamorous status, it has a lot of value in that there's not a lot of people in it.
100%, 100%. And yeah, every time I talk to a fresh grad, I sort of like give them, oh, I know how we got to this topic. We're talking about context independent advice, right? So I think the, apart from like giving them the career modes framework, the sharper ones, the ones who are a lot more thoughtful, immediately realize that the implication of the career modes framework is that they have to keep a finger on the pulse of whatever demand that exists for their skills, which means that they need to build activities or networks that allow them to be updated with that information, right? It could be like making friends with, or finding a, I call it finding a perch in your industry. So you could be like attending meetups and then going to the sort of the meetup after the meetup, because there usually is a meetup after the meetup, usually, like sort of social, you go to a bar, and then that's when the real industry gossip comes out. Or it could be just like helping to organize a major industry event in your industry, right? And that really gives you a perch to sort of like get a feel for what's difficult to hire in your particular corner of the labor market. Or another example might be like you make friends with HR. Well, that's actually very dangerous. You make friends, or you watch what's difficult to hire for. So you listen very carefully when your manager complains to another manager, like, oh, it's so difficult to hire for this role. Or you look at, I think I've heard, I've read sort of reflections on people who wrote scrapers for job ads, and then sort of like did analysis on the job ads and sort of saw like which sectors, which job ads were, what do you call it, more, were up for longer, because that would indicate like difficulty to hire. There are many ways to do this, but the key point that I try to impress when I'm sort of talking to a fresh grad or a student who's about to graduate is like, figure out the shape of the market for your particular career, and then sort of figure out ways to get the skills necessary to fulfill that demand. And this is one shape of the career mode. It's not the only shape, but it's, I think, the more predictable shape that doesn't require as much luck.
There's a wealth of advice that you share with us today. I basically, I think we need to have a book written by Cedric Chin on like a lot of these topics. But I'll ask you one last question, and that is, if you think through your experience with building basically a company, helping build a company, um, working on kind of the common cog, what is one piece of, I'd say, like unconventional advice that you'd want to share with folks listening to this that you've learned through experience, that something that maybe stood out to you?
Wow, this is really hard.
And for
The
the
this
record, it's not the one and only advice. Like, I fully recognize the fact that it's very situational. There's a lot of, it can be one of.
But unconventional is the key word that makes it difficult, right? Because it implies that it goes against mainstream advice. Um, okay, so I do have a piece of advice, but I'm not. I clearly live it. I clearly buy it, but I'm not 100% sure that it is context free. So I'm not 100% sure that it's useful or equally useful to everybody given their dreams and their particular contexts. But I firmly believe, I firmly believe that you have to structure your life in a way to get lucky. And this sort of gets very philosophical. And forgive me for not being very articulate on this because I've tried multiple times to write about this, but I failed every time. Um, One sort of implication that falls out from some of the things that we talk about is that when it comes to life, it comes to career, but also true in life, path dependence really matters. Luck really matters. If you read enough biographies, this really does fall true. Maybe it wouldn't be clear in the first biography or the second biography. You still can sort of lie to yourself and maintain the fiction that, oh, all you need is skills or all you need is network, some of these surface level lessons. But if you read enough biographies, and I have read enough biographies, I think everybody who does read enough biographies or listens to stories from their elders, from their betters, right, you eventually realize that people's careers are the result of luck interactions, chance meetings, random sort of like they follow their nose because they're interested in this topic. And so like the broad takeaway that I have from listening carefully to stories from my mentors or from seniors or reading lots of biographies is really you need to get lucky and you need to think about how to get lucky, right? And how to get lucky it's a very deep topic. There are many things we can talk about, but I think that is the non-mainstream piece of advice that I would place. And there and like working out the implications is left to the is an exercise left for the alert reader because we can probably go 30 minutes just talking about this alone. But
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I hope that's non-mainstream enough.
It is not something that I have heard on the show. So it's definitely one of those things that I'd say, yeah, it makes you think. I'll leave it to our listeners to kind of craft what they think about it. And maybe we need like another follow up to this
Maybe,
that
yeah.
talks about this. Cedric, where can folks learn more about the stuff that you're doing, your writing? And I'll just say, like, definitely subscribe to the membership because it's very much worth it.
Oh, thank you. You can find most of my writing on commoncog.com. That's common COG. And there's lots of free articles, not just the membership. So it's like it's a members only article once every other week. But I do recommend signing up for the newsletter. And if you're interested, I do have a podcast that's not as active as yours, but it's about expertise, or rather, it's called Commonplace Expertise, and the whole premise behind it is I find random people who have expertise, and then I ask them about their expertise. And so, if you're interested in that, I recommend subscribing to that podcast, mostly because it's not very active. So I'm sure I wouldn't be a burden on your time.
I'll say, like, we'll include all the links in the show notes anyway, so you folks can just, it's one click away. And again, Cedric, I think your material is hands down one of the most useful piece of information, like across the board when it comes to
Thank you.
career business frameworks. It's extremely valuable. Highly recommended for anybody listening to go to the site, subscribe to the newsletter. And I find the newsletter actually very fun because you do the articles and then there's like elsewhere on the web and there's like all the relevant stuff.
Yes.
And it's like, all right, this is actually very helpful. So we're getting multiple perspectives. Cedric, thank you so much for joining us today.
And thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed this.